Every standard history textbook on the planet tells the exact same comforting story about the birth of the United States. You know the narrative by heart. It is a cinematic, romantic fable filled with passionate patriots, tricornered hats, and crates of East India Company tea splashing into the dark waters of Boston Harbor. We are told that ordinary colonists, driven by a deep philosophical yearning for abstract liberty, rose up against a tyrannical king because they were furious about paying a minor levy on their afternoon beverage. We are taught that the sparks of rebellion were struck by the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, summarized neatly by the immortal, rallying cry of taxation without representation. It is a clean, morally simple tale. It is also an absolute fiction, a calculated, centuries-old cover-up designed to hide the raw, systemic levers of imperial power. Let us be completely honest with ourselves. A 3 pence tax on a pound of dried leaves does not collapse an entire continental economy. It does not drive peaceful farmers and conservative merchants to pick up muskets and wage a bloody, 8-year war against the world's most formidable military superpower. People do not risk the gallows over a marginal increase in their cost of living. The real conflict was never about tea. It was never about stamps. It was fought over the very ink and paper used to print the money that allowed the colonies to survive. To understand the true catalyst of the American Revolution, we have to look past the political theater and follow the money back to a time when the colonies were actually experiencing an unprecedented economic golden age. Decades before 1776, the American wilderness was transforming into a powerhouse of domestic trade. This prosperity was not built on gold or silver, because the British imperial system actively drained every single piece of precious metal out of the colonies and shipped it directly into the vaults of London banks. Instead, the colonists engineered a brilliant, radical financial innovation known as Colonial Scrip. This was a homegrown, fiat paper currency issued by local colonial authorities, printed in precise amounts to match the actual output of the economy. It was the absolute lifeblood of the American marketplace. Think of it like a thriving local community center where the manager issues custom paper tokens to every member. As long as everyone trusts the tokens, the carpenter can buy bread from the baker can buy iron from the blacksmith, and the entire ecosystem flourishes without a single ounce of real gold changing hands. For decades, this paper money kept unemployment at virtually zero and created a highly self-sufficient, wealthy society completely independent of the European financial elite. It was a beautiful, decentralized engine of growth. But then, the hammer fell. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Currency Act. This was an aggressive, sweeping piece of monetary warfare that completely outlawed the printing and use of colonial scrip overnight. With the single stroke of a quill, the British Board of Trade declared that these local paper tokens were completely illegal, demanding that all future debts and imperial taxes be settled exclusively in gold and silver coin. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. It was an artificial economic cardiac arrest. Imagine that same community center manager suddenly walking into the room, confiscating every single token, and telling the members they can only trade if they use rare, imported silver coins that only he possesses. The marketplace ground to a screeching halt. Within months of the Currency Act, the money supply vanished, triggering a severe, suffocating economic depression that wiped out local commerce, forced mass foreclosures, and left the streets filled with unemployed workers. This brings us to the ultimate buried question that the textbooks refuse to answer. Why would the British Crown deliberately sabotage its most lucrative overseas territories? Why would a global empire consciously choose to choke out a perfectly functioning financial system, plunge an entire continent into an artificial economic depression, and risk a massive colonial backlash just to destroy a piece of printed paper? The answer to that question exposes the hidden architectural blueprint of global empires and reveals that the American Revolution was never a philosophical debate about liberty. It was a brutal, systemic war for monetary sovereignty, a desperate fight for the right to control the printing press. To understand why the British Crown would deliberately sabotage its most lucrative overseas territories and risk a continent-wide rebellion just to destroy a piece of printed paper, we have to peel back the layers of romanticized history and examine the global extraction matrix known as mercantilism. The textbooks often paint the British Empire of the mid-18th century as a loose, disorganized collection of trading posts and distant settlements, but in reality, it was a highly sophisticated, rigidly managed financial siphon. The system was explicitly engineered to ensure that real wealth flowed in only one direction, from the raw wilderness of the American periphery straight into the centralized vaults of London. Under this imperial framework, the American colonies were never meant to be equal partners or self-sustaining societies. They were designated as economic resource colonies, forced to chop down their ancient forests for ship timber, harvest vast fields of tobacco in the southern heat, and trap pelts in the northern valleys, all to be shipped exclusively to British ports on British ships. In return for these raw materials, the colonists were expected to buy finished, manufactured goods produced by factories in England. But there was a devastating structural trap built into this trade loop. The British state heavily restricted the development of independent colonial manufacturing, meaning the Americans were legally forbidden from spinning their own fine textiles or smelting their own complex iron tools. This created a permanent widening trade deficit. The value of the raw materials the colonies exported was systematically kept lower than the high cost of the manufactured goods they were forced to import. To settle the balance on this uneven ledger, the British demanded payment in the only medium that mattered to the European financial establishment, physical gold and silver coin, known as specie. The math simply did not work. The colonies were bleeding dry. Every single year, virtually every piece of precious metal that entered the ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia was immediately packed into iron-bound chests and shipped right back across the Atlantic to satisfy British merchants. This continuous outward drain of hard currency created a desperate, grinding reality for ordinary people living on the ground in America. Inside the domestic colonial economy, physical money was almost completely non-existent. A farmer who wanted to buy a new plow from the local blacksmith could not offer coins because neither of them had ever seen a silver shilling. Transactions devolved into a cumbersome, inefficient web of barter, IOUs, and heavy ledgers of credit that took years to settle. The entire domestic marketplace was suffocating from an artificial lack of monetary oxygen. This scarcity was not an accident of geography. It was the logical result of institutional incentives, dictated by the architects of the British financial system. In 1694, the creation of the Bank of England had completely revolutionized global finance by tying the British government's sovereign debt to a private network of hyper-wealthy lenders and financiers. This new financial elite held immense sway over the British Parliament and the Board of Trade. From their opulent townhouses and counting houses in London, these banking elites looked across the ocean and did not see citizens or communities. They saw a massive, permanent ledger of accounts receivable. They required their interest payments and corporate profits to be paid in hard, immutable gold and silver to fund their global financial games. Completely indifferent to the economic paralysis this extraction caused in the colonies, faced with total economic starvation, the desperate colonial assemblies realized they had to innovate or face complete ruin. They decided to break the unspoken rules of the Imperial Handbook. Beginning with Massachusetts in 1690 and spreading rapidly to Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, individual colonies began printing their own legal paper currency. This was the birth of Colonial Scrip. It was a radical, bottom-up act of financial self-defense. Unlike the currencies of Europe, this paper money was not backed by gold mines or hoards of silver. Instead, it was backed by the future tax revenues of the colonies and the collective productivity of the people who used it. Benjamin Franklin, a brilliant young printer in Philadelphia, recognized the profound genius of this artificial medium of exchange. He noticed that before paper money, the streets of his city were quiet, businesses were failing, and the economy was locked in a frozen state of permanent debt. But after Pennsylvania introduced its own paper scrip, the entire landscape transformed almost overnight. Franklin became an outspoken champion of the system, writing extensive economic treatises proving that a managed supply of paper currency was the only way to liberate an economy from the predatory scarcity of gold. He even used his own printing presses to produce the notes, ensuring they were designed with intricate anti-counterfeiting measures. The results of this financial rebellion were nothing short of miraculous. By printing their own money in direct proportion to the actual demands of local trade, the colonies bypassed the London banking monopoly entirely. Suddenly, the blacksmith could be paid instantly for his work, the merchant could buy grain from the farmer, and new enterprises could be funded without a single ounce of British gold. For several glorious decades in the mid-18th century, the American colonies experienced an unprecedented golden age of domestic prosperity, full employment, and rapid infrastructure growth. They had successfully built a parallel financial universe that operated outside the control of the global elite, but this independent success was an intolerable insult to the masters of the British Empire. To the London financiers, the sight of a booming, self-sufficient American economy was not a triumph to be celebrated. It was an existential threat to their monopoly on global credit. If the colonists could generate their own liquidity and trade among themselves without paying tribute to British lenders, the entire imperial extraction machine would collapse. Furthermore, British merchants began complaining bitterly that when they did accept colonial paper money for debts, its value fluctuated, allowing colonists to pay off their old obligations in depreciated local currency, rather than the hard silver the elites felt entitled to. The British Board of Trade began receiving a steady stream of panicked letters from wealthy stakeholders demanding that Parliament reassert absolute control over the colonial monetary supply. The stage was set for a total systemic collision. The irrepressible growth of a young, decentralized continent had run directly into the rigid, unyielding wall of an old, heavily indebted empire that refused to let its prized dependencies slip away from its financial grasp. The economic collision arrived with absolute, calculated finality in the spring of 1764. The British Parliament, acting as the enforcement arm of the London banking elite, passed the Currency Act, a piece of imperial legislation that was not a minor regulatory adjustment, but a structural demolition of the entire American financial architecture. To understand the sheer scale of this economic assault, we must first dissect the exact legal mechanics of what the British did and how the colonial monetary system actually functioned before it was brutally dismantled. In the decades leading up to this crisis, the colonial assemblies had mastered the art of managing their own money supply through Colonial Scrip, a homegrown paper medium created out of thin air to solve a devastating physical shortage of precious metals. When a colony like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts printed scrip, they did not just hand it out randomly to citizens, but instead issued it through institutional land banks, loaning the paper bills to local farmers and merchants who pledged their real estate as collateral. The borrowers then spent this currency into the local marketplace, using it to pay for labor, goods, and domestic colonial taxes, creating a perfectly balanced, self-correcting cycle where the money supply grew when the economy expanded and shrunk when taxes were paid back to the colonial treasury and the paper bills were systematically burned. It was a closed, highly efficient domestic loop that allowed a young continent to thrive without ever needing to grovel before the predatory gold lenders of Europe. But the Currency Act of 1764 brought this entire parallel financial universe to a violent end by completely banning the issuance of any new colonial paper money and declaring all existing scrip entirely illegal for the payment of public or private debts. To fully grasp what this felt like for the ordinary colonist on the ground, imagine you are playing at a bustling, highly prosperous casino where the management has issued custom house chips to everyone at the tables, allowing the players to win, trade chips among themselves, buy drinks, rent rooms, and keep the entire establishment running at peak efficiency, because everyone agrees that these pieces of plastic represent real, tangible value within those walls. Now imagine the casino boss suddenly walks onto the floor with a squad of armed guards, blows a loud whistle, and announces that every single house chip in circulation is completely worthless, declaring that from this exact moment on, all bets, all drinks, and all outstanding debts to the casino must be paid exclusively in rare, heavy gold coins minted in a distant country across the ocean, coins that none of the players actually possess. The tables instantly freeze, the games stop, and the prosperity vanishes, replaced by a suffocating panic as the boss demands immediate payment for debts that are now literally impossible to settle. This is exactly what the British Parliament did to the American colonies, criminalizing the very medium of human survival and replacing a thriving system of local credit with a vacuum of absolute scarcity. The resulting monetary contraction was not a passive economic statistic recorded on a ledger, but rather a living, breathing predator that stalked every farm, workshop, and colonial storefront across the Atlantic coast. It acted like a massive vacuum chamber, slowly sucking the oxygen out of a crowded room, where at first you only notice a slight tightness in your chest, but then, as the pressure drops, your vision blurs, your muscles fail, and you realize you are suffocating in a space where you once breathed freely. The sudden disappearance of paper money completely paralyzed daily life because the British imperial system had already drained the colonies of physical gold and silver, meaning there was no alternative currency available to take its place. But here is the catch. The British authorities knew exactly what they were doing, and they were not blind to the economic devastation they were unleashing across the ocean. In fact, the suffering of the American colonists was a deliberate feature of the policy, not an accidental bug, because the masters of the British financial system wanted to crush colonial self-sufficiency and reassert the absolute dominance of centralized London capital. When the money supply vanished, it triggered an immediate vicious deflationary spiral, an economic monster that reverses the natural order of time and value by making cash artificially scarce, which causes the purchasing power of a single coin to skyrocket while the value of physical property and human labor plummets into the abyss. Imagine an accordion being violently squeezed shut by a heavy hand, where the physical space inside the instrument disappears, crushing everything caught between the folds. For a colonial farmer, this meant that a bushel of wheat that once sold for 5 shillings now commanded only 1 shilling on the open market, representing an 80% collapse in the price of his crop. However, his mortgage, his commercial agreements, and his existing debts to British merchants did not shrink by a single penny because the numerical value of his obligations remained completely fixed, meaning that the real physical cost of his debt had effectively multiplied by 5. He now had to harvest, pack, and sell 5 times as much wheat just to pay off the exact same historical debt, a mathematical impossibility that transformed the entire colonial agricultural class into structural insolvents overnight. To make matters worse, this artificial scarcity completely destroyed what economists call the velocity of money, a technical term used to describe how fast a single unit of currency moves from one hand to another, generating economic life with every single transaction. Think of it like the blood circulating through a human body, where as long as the heart pumps and the blood flows rapidly through the veins, every organ receives vital nutrients, wounds heal, and the body remains energetic and alive. But if you slice an artery or tie a tight tourniquet around a limb, the circulation stops, the tissue starves, turns black, and dies. The Currency Act was a financial tourniquet wrapped tightly around the throat of American commerce, dropping the velocity of money to absolute zero and causing the local economy to suffer a massive systemic stroke. Without paper scrip, the basic day-to-day transactions of society collapsed into a primitive, frustrating system of barter where a shoemaker who needed firewood had to search for a lumberjack who specifically needed shoes. a dynamic that ground the specialized division of labor to a halt and forced businesses into bankruptcy simply because they lacked the physical tokens required to trade. It gets worse. The structural trap engineered by the British state was about to be slammed shut with a series of aggressive new imperial levies. When modern textbooks discuss the Stamp Act of 1765 or the Townshend Acts, they treat them as simple political provocations, minor arguments over the abstract philosophy of legislative representation that happen to annoy the colonists. They completely ignore the lethal monetary context of these laws. The British Parliament did not just levy these new taxes on paper legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and glass. They explicitly mandated that these taxes must be paid exclusively in British silver and gold coin, creating the ultimate systemic extortion machine. The left hand of the empire had just used the Currency Act to criminalize and destroy the colonists' paper money, ensuring they had no cash to trade among themselves, while the right hand of the empire demanded that they hand over rare precious metal coins directly to the royal treasury. If an American lawyer, merchant, or ship captain could not produce physical British silver to pay for the royal stamp on a legal contract or a shipping manifest, his business was declared illegal, his cargo was subject to immediate confiscation, and he was hauled before a British vice-admiralty court to face ruin. These courts operated without juries, presided over by royal judges who received a direct financial percentage of all the property they confiscated, turning the legal system into a predatory racket. The taxes were never meant to just raise revenue for the king's army. They were designed as an asset-stripping mechanism, a legal dragnet engineered to force the forfeiture of colonial land, ships, warehouses, and family estates directly into the hands of British creditors and imperial officials. The merchants of the City of London, operating in tandem with the directors of the Bank of England, understood that control over the medium of exchange was the ultimate form of geopolitical leverage, a tool far more powerful than any standing army. By choking off local currency, they transformed the American continent into a captive market of desperate debtors who could no longer buy goods from each other and were forced to beg for extended lines of credit from London trading houses. This imperial credit came with exorbitant interest rates and predatory terms, ensuring that every ship sailing from London to Boston carried manufactured goods priced in a currency the colonists could not control, forcing the Americans deeper into a black hole of compounding interest. The entire colonial elite, from wealthy plantation owners in Virginia like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to bustling shipping merchants in Boston like John Hancock, found themselves hopelessly ensnared in this financial web, realizing that no matter how hard they worked, they were running on a treadmill designed by London bankers to keep them permanently dependent. The financial sovereignty of the colonies had been completely obliterated, and the Currency Act of 1764 stood as the hidden engine behind every major protest, every riot, and every radical political tract that emerged in the decade leading up to 1776, serving as the cold structural reality that made peaceful coexistence with the British Empire an absolute impossibility. The mounting pressure inside the American colonies throughout the early 1770s was not an ideological debate occurring in abstract vacuums, but a physical tightening of an economic noose that was strangling every household from Massachusetts to Georgia. The standard narrative desperately wants us to view the escalating resistance as spontaneous outbursts of pure patriotic fervor, treating events like the Boston Tea Party of 1773 as a glorious, almost theatrical defense of liberty. But when you strip away the romanticized gloss and look at the ledger, the true nature of that cold December night becomes clear. The East India Company, a corporate empire intertwined with the British state and the Bank of England, had been granted a monopoly to dump cheap tea directly into the American market, bypassing local merchants. Crucially, this bailout required taxes to be paid exclusively in hard, non-existent British silver. The tea ships sitting in Boston Harbor were not just carrying a dried botanical luxury. They represented the physical manifestation of an external monopoly designed to drain the final drops of precious metal out of a cash-starved continent. Dumping that tea was a desperate, defensive act of economic sabotage against a state-sanctioned financial invasion that threatened to bankrupt every local merchant who had already been stripped of their colonial scrip. The explosion was inevitable. You cannot lock a society in an economic vacuum chamber, strip away its monetary oxygen, and expect it to remain peaceful. By the time the First Continental Congress gathered in the shadows of Philadelphia in September of 1774, the conversation behind closed doors had shifted entirely away from polite legal petitions to the cold mathematics of survival. The delegates were not wide-eyed radicals dreaming of utopian republics. They were pragmatists, wealthy plantation owners, experienced merchants, and astute lawyers who understood that the British military machine was merely the enforcement arm of the London banking syndicate. They knew that a military clash was looming, but they faced a terrifying systemic paradox that threatened to doom their rebellion before a single shot was fired. To fight a war against the global superpower of the era, you need an astronomical amount of capital to purchase gunpowder, forge cannons, manufacture uniforms, and feed thousands of marching soldiers. Yet, because of the merciless enforcement of the Currency Act of 1764, The colonies possessed no centralized treasury, no gold reserves, and an economy completely paralyzed by a decade of artificial monetary deflation. The British had intentionally stripped them of their domestic casino chips, leaving them entirely empty-handed on the eve of the greatest geopolitical gamble in history. The realization was terrifying. You cannot fund a war with abstract philosophy. The breaking point arrived on a misty morning in April of 1775 on the green of Lexington and Concord. The textbooks tell us the British regulars marched out of Boston to seize a hidden cache of colonial gunpowder, but they ignored the deeper reality that the British military was moving to violently disarm the colonists of their physical capability to resist an ongoing asset-stripping operation. The musket fire that echoed across the New England countryside was the sound of a debtor class finally firing back at the collection agents of the empire. But as the smoke cleared and the reality of an all-out war set in, the leaders of the rebellion did something far more radical, far more dangerous to the British Crown than organizing a volunteer militia. In June of 1775, a full year before they would ever dare to draft a formal declaration of independence, the Continental Congress authorized the printing of the continental currency. This was the moment the open loop was definitively resolved. The leaders of the revolution recognized that political defiance was a complete illusion if they remained shackled to the monetary architecture of the Bank of England. They did not wait for permission. They did not wait for gold mines to be discovered, and they did not beg for foreign loans. They seized the printing press. They understood that to claim sovereignty, you must first create your own medium of exchange. The sound of those crude, hand-cranked printing presses in Philadelphia was the true declaration of war against the British financial empire. By issuing the Continental Dollar, backed by nothing more than the future potential of an independent American nation, the revolutionaries were resurrecting the ghost of Colonial Scrip, rebuilding the parallel financial universe that the Currency Act had sought to permanently destroy. It was a breathless, high-stakes race against time as paper bills flooded the colonies, instantly restoring the lost velocity of money, providing the desperate liquidity needed to hire soldiers, purchase supplies, and keep the domestic economy from completely collapsing under the weight of a British naval blockade. The printing presses ran day and night. Money flowed. The army marched. The system was reborn. This brings us to the absolute climax of the narrative, the hot July days of 1776 inside the Pennsylvania State House. When Thomas Jefferson sat at his desk to pen the words that would alter human history, he was writing the political obituary of a financial arrangement that had grown too predatory to bear. The Declaration of Independence is celebrated today for its rhetoric about unalienable rights. But if you read the document closely, looking past the poetic preambles to the specific bitter grievances levied against King George III, you find the unmistakable fingerprints of a currency war. The document explicitly condemns the Crown for cutting off our trade and imposing taxes without consent, direct references to the asset-stripping levies that had drained the colonies of their wealth. The Declaration was the formal, irrevocable shattering of the imperial financial cage. The delegates who signed that parchment were fully aware that they were committing high treason, a crime punishable by the gallows. But they also knew that staying within the empire meant a slow economic death by strangulation, a life of permanent debt slavery to a private central banking cartel across the ocean. The American Revolution was never just a political divorce from a distant monarch. It was a violent, uncompromising war for monetary independence, a total systemic rebellion against a global superpower that had weaponized the scarcity of money to turn an entire continent into a captive financial plantation. When empires wage monetary warfare, the casualties are never just abstract numbers recorded on an imperial balance sheet. The real damage is measured in the quiet, desperate destruction of everyday human lives. The sudden violent elimination of colonial scrip by the Currency Act of 1764 did not just alter the macroeconomics of transatlantic trade. It tore through the very fabric of colonial society, transforming a once prosperous continent into a bleak landscape of systemic human suffering. To understand the true weight of this catastrophe, we must look past the grand political speeches of the Continental Congress and step directly into the modest, timber-framed homes of ordinary colonial families. A farmer who had spent 3 decades clearing dense forests, digging stone wells, and raising livestock with his bare hands suddenly found himself staring at a legal eviction notice written in the cold, unyielding script of a royal court. Because the domestic money supply had been artificially vacuumed out of the marketplace, he could no longer find a single piece of silver or gold coin to settle his fixed debts, or pay the aggressive new imperial taxes demanded by the crown. When the royal bailiff inevitably arrived to auction off the property to satisfy a distant London creditor, there was no local currency available for neighbors to bid the price up to its true value. A 100-acre homestead, representing a lifetime of backbreaking human labor, would be sold on the auction block for a handful of miserable silver shillings to a wealthy loyalist speculator or an agent of a British merchant house. The family would be thrown out onto the winter roads with nothing but the clothes on their backs. This monetary starvation unleashed a brutal epidemic of institutionalized misery across the Atlantic coast. Throughout the 1760s and early 1770s, the local debtor prisons, which were damp, unheated, disease-ridden stone vaults, began overflowing with honest, hard-working tradesmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, and decorated veterans who had fought for the British Empire in the French and Indian War. These men had committed no moral crime. They were simply the structural victims of an economy that had been stripped of its medium of exchange. A highly skilled craftsman who possessed a warehouse packed with valuable iron plows or fine leather boots could still see his business destroyed and his freedom stolen simply because the state had criminalized the paper tokens that allowed those goods to change hands. The sheer psychological terror of watching your family face starvation while your life's work was legally plundered by the state created a deep, burning resentment that no minor tax on tea could ever explain. This was not a polite, philosophical disagreement over the abstract nuances of legislative representation. This was a desperate, existential fight for survival against a predatory financial machine that was systematically turning independent, thriving communities into a permanent underclass of dispossessed tenants. While ordinary colonists were watching their livelihoods collapse into bankruptcy, the financial elite who pulled the levers of power in London remained completely insulated from the human wreckage they had engineered. For the directors of the Bank of England, the hyper-wealthy stakeholders of the East India Company, and the aristocratic members of Parliament, the economic paralysis of the American colonies was not a tragedy to be avoided, but a wildly successful asset-stripping operation. Sitting in their opulent, wood-paneled estates along the River Thames, surrounded by imported luxury goods and sipping fine wines, these London financiers watched the real value of their colonial accounts receivables skyrocket as artificial deflation took hold across the ocean. Every farm seized by a royal judge, every colonial cargo ship confiscated by a vice-admiralty court without a jury, and every scarce silver coin squeezed out of a dying American town was a direct victory for their centralized monetary monopoly. Within the cold, calculation-driven logic of the mercantile system, the colonists were never viewed as actual citizens with human rights. They were merely disposable units of economic production designed to service the debt of a heavily leveraged empire. The suffering of the public was an intentional feature of the policy, engineered to break the back of American self-sufficiency and force the continent back into complete financial submission. This brings us to the ultimate cover-up, the calculated institutional campaign to rewrite history that began almost immediately after the smoke cleared from the battlefield. The raw, terrifying financial mechanics of this currency war were systematically scrubbed from the official narrative, replaced by a sanitized, romanticized national fable. If you open any standard history textbook today, the Currency Act of 1764 is either completely omitted or minimized into an insignificant, single-sentence footnote that students are told to skip. Instead, the entire focus of the educational curriculum is deliberately steered toward colorful, theatrical spectacles like the Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act riots, and high-minded abstract rhetoric about the philosophical definition of liberty. This sweeping historical sanitization was not an accident of poor historical record-keeping. It was a conscious, multi-generational effort by educational institutions and financial gatekeepers to ensure that the public never learned how the true levers of global power operate. The architects of the modern financial system understood a fundamental truth. If you can control how a population remembers its past, you can control how they perceive their present. If the general public believes that the American Revolution was ignited by a simple 3-pence tax on a morning beverage, they will remain completely blind to the far more sophisticated ways their own wealth is extracted by central banks today. If you train generations of citizens to believe that freedom is merely an abstract concept tied to voting booths, national flags, and patriotic slogans, they will never think to look closely at the manipulated interest rates, the artificial inflation cycles, and the monopoly currency systems that keep them trapped on a modern financial treadmill. The story had to be completely rewritten to protect the foundational myth of central banking itself. By transforming a brutal, bloody war for monetary sovereignty into a polite, simplified protest against taxation without representation, the gatekeepers of history successfully hid the ultimate weapon of empire, ensuring that the power to create and control the money supply remained safely hidden from the eyes of the very people it was designed to govern. The global financial architecture of the 21st century looks remarkably different on the surface, from the primitive wooden sailing ships, heavy iron chests, and ink-stained ledgers of the old British Empire, yet the underlying system code running our world remains completely unchanged. Today, the entire planet is locked in a massive, hyper-connected game of monetary dominance, where the ultimate weapon of global empire is no longer a fleet of royal warships anchored off a colonial harbor, but rather the absolute weaponization of the global reserve currency. For decades, developing nations across the global south have occupied an economic position that mirror images the exact plight of the 13 American colonies, acting as peripheral resource engines that export physical goods, valuable raw metals, and backbreaking human labor to the West, only to see their domestic wealth systematically drained away to service compounding debts denominated in a foreign currency they are legally powerless to print. When these sovereign nations find themselves trapped in a chronic, suffocating cycle of economic austerity, structural adjustment programs, and budget cuts imposed by centralized international banking networks, they are experiencing the exact same artificial monetary starvation that paralyzed Pennsylvania and Massachusetts after the passage of the Currency Act of 1764. The modern struggle for what economists call de-dollarization is not a sudden, random wave of geopolitical friction, but a direct continuation of the exact same war for monetary sovereignty that ignited the American continent over 2.5 centuries ago. When we look closely at the contemporary rise of alternative trading blocs, independent international payment systems, and bilateral currency agreements, we are watching modern nations attempt to print their own version of colonial scrip to bypass a centralized financial monopoly. But the modern masters of the ledger react with the exact same panic and administrative fury as the 18th century British Board of Trade when their control over global credit is threatened. If a developing country tries to trade its oil, its grain, or its copper using its own sovereign currency instead of the global reserve standard, the heavy hammer of financial warfare falls with absolute precision, deploying sweeping economic sanctions, freezing central bank assets, and cutting off international communication networks to crush the rebellion before it can spread to other players. It brings us right back to that original smoky casino floor, where the players are desperately trying to trade with their own handcrafted house chips, only to realize that the rules of the house are still rigidly policed by a distant, invisible boss who demands absolute submission to his monopoly tokens. The tools have merely evolved from royal decrees and wax stamps into digital bank codes, algorithmic interest rate adjustments, and swift network bans, but the strategic objective remains completely identical, ensuring that the peripheral world remains a captive debt plantation for a centralized financial elite. We are still living inside the matrix of an ongoing currency war where political borders are a complete illusion and true independence is only granted to those who possess the raw power to defend their own printing press. If history has proven anything, it is that a society can wave any flag it desires, elect any leaders it chooses, and celebrate any abstract concept of liberty it wants. But as long as an external banking system controls the very lifeblood of its commerce, it remains a colony in everything but name. Which leaves us with an unsettling, urgent question as we navigate our own volatile economic landscape: who truly controls the purchasing power of the money sitting in your bank account today, and what happens to your freedom when the House decides to turn off the liquidity? Thank you for uncovering the past with us today. If you want to break free from standard historical narratives and join a community that values deep financial truth, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think modern de-dollarization will lead to true monetary independence for developing nations, or will the centralized global financial architecture find a new way to reassert its dominance just like the empires of old? Let me know your perspective, and once you have left your comment, click on the next video on your screen to uncover another buried truth about the financial systems that built our world.